I think this should be fine. Cool. Okay, cool. Hi everyone, and welcome to the first ever video of the Asian Schools Debating Championship ASDC training series. I'll be talking about economics and what you should do in economics debate. Um, Ironically, I got a B in my A levels economics, but I trust myself to be able to tell you a bunch of things about what you should do when you are navigating debates surrounding economics and how do you do this well. So, what can you expect from this lecture? I'll be looking through like a few common clashes in debates on the economy. I'm gonna find like both case studies and also just real world examples to back up either sides of these kind of clashes. And then later on, I'll also just talk about how do you, in general, conceptualize economics motion and how do you generally improve your understanding of the theme. How do you get good at talking about things like overpopulation, talking about things like labor unions, talking about things like patterns and like retail investing and so forth also. Lastly, I'll just talk about some very common concepts that you either see in motions or to be used as analysis within motions also. So yeah, expect something fun from this. So the primary clash that you see in a lot of debates surrounding the economy is one that's very simple, which revolves around the idea of welfare against efficiency. So there are a few examples of motions to this particular clash. So the first one is this house would require economy workers to be hired as employees. This is good because they are subjected to things like minimum wage laws, they're subjected to labor protection laws and so forth, but it also means that they are a bit more expensive. It likely means that a lot of your gig economy employers have less reasons to want to take on like like workers if they believe that they have to pay more in order to like protect them. The second one is this house believes that trade unions and labor protection laws should be suspended during times of economic crisis. You can explain what are the incentive of trade union. You can also explain why are trade unions good, but also just analyzing as to whether or not trade unions are necessarily beneficial at times of economic crisis where there is a recession, where there's like less willingness to want to spend, and also employers are just struggling to pay up their workers and so forth also, which I think is a pretty important debate. So this doesn't just apply to economic crisis, but the other common theme that I see around this is also during healthcare crisis. So will you suspend like your unions of doctors and medical professional if it means you're able to overwork them, you're able to make sure that they are really tending to the patient even at the expense of their own well-being and their own welfare. The third one is this house will prosecute business leaders for environmental crimes committed by the companies. Another really common one that's somewhat like tangential to this one is also this house will hold the MNCs liable for human rights violation that occurs at any point in the supply chain. So welfare here doesn't just extend to material welfare, like your labor rights, your workers' rights, and whatever, but it can also be other things that might be more important than the economy. They come at a particular trade-off of whether the economy is more important than all these different things. So examples of this can be things like the environment, but it can also be things like human rights. It can also be things like democracy, national security for things like AI. There's a bunch of other things that we as humans might value a bit more than the economy. And a lot of debates just center themselves around should parts of the economy be sacrificed in order for us to be able to attain this particular good. Either this is environmental protection, either this is welfare, either this is like securing and safeguarding democracy. All these different things you have to weigh separately and do well in the debate. Any debate on taxes effectively are also like this, like sin taxes, windfall taxes, inheritance taxes. The most popular one that I've seen is any idea about like this house supports the development of like sin cities. So places like Bangkok, places like Amsterdam, a place where you legalize things like prostitution, legalize things like drugs and whatnot. In terms of welfare, this is like pretty bad in the sense that, you know, it encourages a lot of businesses to run things that are counterintuitive against welfare. So, for instance, the fact that people are doing drugs is quite bad. The fact that people are engaging in prostitution might also be morally something that's questionable. But you can also argue that this is something that leads to economic growth. This is something that is required in order for the economy to function. This is required for governments to be able to get money, to be able to spend on things like healthcare, to spend on education, and other important things. So, a lot of these debates also center around maybe one kind of welfare against another welfare. So, for instance, in the debate about like sin cities, it can also just be the welfare of those engaging in the consumption of those sin. So, if you're a very heavy drinker, if you're someone that engages in like recreational drugs or engage in things like prostitution, your welfare might be sacrificed for the welfare of maybe people that are making those kinds of things, like your drug suppliers, like your prostitutes and whatnot, that are in or like your sex workers that are engaging in those kinds of work that could benefit from these things being legalized and being developed, but that doesn't always mean that it's something that's beneficial. So I'll just give a few case study of where this happens. But firstly, um I mean, it's true that intuition usually defaults to protecting the welfare of the general public, but it doesn't always have to be the case, because there are multiple instances where the state severely crack down upon your civil liberties and your human rights for the sake of like just rapid economic growth and modernization. So this often looks like the repression of labor unions, especially in terms of negotiating and collective bargaining. But this can also just be in general things like um gunning down protesters that are protesting against very unfavorable working condition. Or it can also just be things like engaging in crony capitalism, where you're doing things like backdoor deals and whatnot. Similarly, there are also states where increased labor protection laws led to increased productivity and also just equitable distribution of income, and that might also just be pretty good. Let's look at a few case studies for the clash above. So let's look at the first one, which is Chile and Pinochet. So the historical context behind this was that in September 1973, the Marxist president of like the first ever democratically elected Marxist president Salvador Allende, who was a pretty big spender. He spent a lot on things like welfare, spent a lot on things like education, expanded labor rights and whatnot. But obviously, if you're doing this, your economy might be slowed down. And during this time, Chile was going through a particular depressive economic period, which is why people are just generally not very happy with it. And also the fact that he's a Marxist didn't help, especially when during the 1970s, during the 90s also, where they were like very like anti-communist sentiment, especially if you're closer to the US. He was overthrown in a coup d'etat by General Augusto Pinochet with the backing of the US government. I think back then was Henry Kissinger and like a bunch of other people that were involved in backing up the military. Pinochet recruited what we now know today as the Chicago Boys. These are a bunch of Chilean economists that studied in the University of Chicago, and a lot of them were very free market oriented to implement Chile's economic policy. So during this particular time, the things that we saw were mass privatization of state-owned industries, but also just attracting corporations to go through these areas via things like tax cuts and whatnot to attract investment. Another thing that I think happened during this period is also just the fact that there was significant deregulation. So I think indigenous land was sold off to corporations and companies so that they have more ability to expand their operations to a lot of these areas, especially in indigenous land where there's an abundance of natural resources that corporations would like to extract, right? There were also just very intense crackdown upon political dissidents and significant reduction in social welfare programs. So you can read this later on, but during this particular time, a lot of people were thrown from like a lot of like leftist political dissidents were thrown from helicopters. A lot of them were forcefully disappeared and whatnot. But this did lead to an increase in the GDP because corporations that were driven out by Allende were returned back. They found confidence in the economy. They believe that Chile and Pinochet is like are good business partners to have during this time. There was a cost. I mean, the economy grew, but as the economy grew, the wealth disparity and the wealth inequality between the rich and the poor also became a lot more intense. Which is why even right now, Chile is also one of the more like unequal countries within Latin America. Labor unions were crushed, so workers were underpaid, and then the income of the wealthy class increased in the process. So I think during this particular time, the income of the wealthy increased by like 83%, 84%. But for a lot of like working class individuals, a lot of their wages kind of stagnate or just went down because there were just no labor unions to be able to advocate for their rights on their behalf, right? So while it is true that this policy was one that created wealth, it was mostly concentrated in the top. But this was something that was able to successfully reverse a lot of the depression that was like harming Chile during the time of Salvador Allende. So there might be some good there also. The other example is South Korea under President Park Chung-hee. I think the daughter or the great granddaughter or the granddaughter like Park Geun-hye was also impeached by the South Korean like judiciary for engaging in corruption. But prior to that, Park Chung-hee was the more like well-known one. So elected in 1963 as president of South Korea. He's and like a very avowed anti-communist and pushed economic policies that were what we would describe today as state capitalists. So the state is the one that's responsible for participating and also engaging in the capitalistic framework of the economy within the economy, and that led to what we now know today as the Miracle on the Han River, where South Korea became what it is in the modern era precisely because of this. During this particular time, South Korea experienced rapid modernization and economic growth, increase in workers' productivity. South Korean export also became a lot more attractive, a lot more lucrative, and there were significant global attraction that geared towards their tech industry. And this was primarily due to also the rise and the formation of chaebols, which are family-owned conglomerates. And a lot of these family-owned businesses were granted not just significant financial support, but also just granted legal monopolies over certain industries. They expanded a lot. They became conglomerates that we know today, like Samsung, LG, Hyundai, Lotte. They're all like chaebols that benefited significantly from the economic policies of Park Chung-hee because he was the one that gave them a lot of money and gave them a monopoly, and that allowed them to be able to conduct like research and development that allowed them to diversify across other different industries also. Um, but at the same time, the Korean Central Intelligence Agency, the KCIA, also arrested and tortured activists and labor organizers. So during this time, martial law was declared. The parliament was dissolved. So the president himself was able to issue emergency decree and concentrate power over there. You can look up through things like the Gwangju uprising, or to just look through a lot of the things that happened back then during South Korea's like Cold War era, where a lot of like labor unions and a lot of like protesters and activists were gunned down by the Korean military. And it was pretty dark time during South Korea for South Korea also. I think it's pretty like fun to read up upon these things and read up about how South Korea gradually democratized to become what it is today. The next one is so you can tell that from the case of South Korea and Chile, it seems that the economic liberty growth must come at the expense of welfare and civil liberties. So corporations tend to favor more deregulated environment for them to conduct their business. The more deregulated it is, the less they have to spend on trying to like absorb the regulatory costs of things like supervision, of things like doing due diligence and whatnot. It also means that governments can sell off indigenous land or land that is prone to things like environmental harms to companies to expand the operation. It can also be things like cronyism and corruption. So it's easy to participate in things like backdoor deals, treaties that are free trade oriented with like maybe rival nations or whatever without much public scrutiny, and all of these are like pretty bad. But this doesn't always have to be the case. And we can look at the example of Sweden during the time of Olaf Palmer. So it's Olaf with an O, not an A. Um, so under Olaf Palmer, Sweden adopted a more social democratic approach. You can look at the things here. So they expanded the welfare state, they empowered trade unions, they also just expanded the public sector and the civil service. There's a reduction in things like unemployment rates also. What are the economic outcomes of this? The economy did grow, but it grew at a slower rate compared to the past because when the government hired more people, GDP growth went from around 4.6 annually to around 1.5, 1.8. Um, due to the empowerment of like trade unions in negotiating for wages equally all across the sector, smaller businesses that cannot afford the increase in labor expenditure like made many have to scale down their operation or just many close down because they couldn't afford to pay their workers properly. But the general quality of life for a lot of these individuals were higher. Like individuals had to pay for basic amenities and services. People became a bit more productive, and that's just generally quite important also. Um, the basic TLDR that you get from this first part is that you'll notice very basic economic concepts, things like trickle-down economics that were popularized by Ronald Reagan, where the impacts of the economic growth will gradually be felt by everyone else. So when corporations expand, they have to hire more workers. When they hire more workers, workers are able to be hired and get like income, and that's pretty good also. There's also this thing about endogenous growth. So a lot of people view public goods as like, oh, it's wasteful and whatnot. But I think even right now, a lot of private corporations and private companies also recognize the importance of public goods for the general benefit of the economy, which is why you also have things like the increase in private healthcare, the increase in private education, because even though these are things that might not lead to like short-term return on investment, people do view these things to be commercially viable and also economically beneficial. The last one that you might see here is about moral hazards, right? So when an economic actor is protected from the consequence of their action, so things like bailing out of failing industries, things like unemployment benefits, that lead to people being able to benefit directly from things that they did. So in terms of failing industries, they failed maybe because they took on a bit too much risk. Unemployment benefits, while good for people that are really struggling, might be really bad for people that just want to leech off the like welfare of the state also, which like could be really, really bad in some instances.